My in-laws moved into my house while I was on vacation. Before we begin the story, make sure to subscribe to our channel and never miss more incredible stories every day. I stood on my own front porch, listening to strangers laughing inside my locked house. The key, the one I had carried on my ring for 10 years, refused to turn. It wasn't just jammed. The entire deadbolt mechanism had been completely replaced. A shiny, cheap brass cylinder mocked me where my heavy brushed nickel lock used to be. This house was my absolute sanctuary. I bought it 5 years before I even met my wife, Chloe. I paid the mortgage, I curated every square inch of the interior, and I legally owned the property outright as a pre-marital asset. It was my designated safe zone from a loud, chaotic world. I had just returned 2 days early from a grueling 2-week business trip in Europe, exhausted, jet-lagged, and desperately craving the pristine silence of my own living room. Instead, I stood outside in the damp suburban air, feeling the cold autumn wind cut through my wool coat, staring at a shadow moving past the frosted glass of my front door. My own property had become impenetrable to me. What would you do if the fortress you built suddenly locked you out? The stakes here were not merely about real estate or financial equity. This was a calculated, devastating assault on my fundamental autonomy. I dropped my leather suitcase onto the porch, the heavy thud barely registering over the muffled sound of a television blaring a daytime game show from my living room. I didn't know who was inside yet, but the primal, territorial rage was already building in my chest. I had structured my entire existence around boundaries, order, and control. Someone had just forcefully breached the perimeter of my life. I raised my fist and began pounding fiercely against the solid oak door, demanding entry to the world I had built. My knuckles ached with every strike, but the adrenaline masked the physical pain completely. Then, the laughter inside abruptly stopped, replaced by the heavy, ominous sound of footsteps approaching the entryway. The door handle finally began to turn, revealing a nightmare I never anticipated. To understand the sheer audacity of this breach, you have to understand my marriage to Chloe. Chloe is deeply conflict avoidant, possessing an almost pathological inability to set boundaries with her parents, Greg and Susan. Greg is an aggressive, perpetually entitled man who views the success of others as a personal insult unless he can directly benefit from it. Susan is his enabler, a master of passive-aggressive intrusion who weaponizes victimhood whenever she is challenged. From the moment we got married, they viewed my house not as our private home, but as an extended family resort. They would drop by unannounced, critique my minimalist decor, and treat my carefully organized spaces with blatant disrespect. I am a pragmatic, structured professional. I despise chaos. Over the years, I had to be the enforcer, the bad guy who installed security cameras and explicitly forbade them from having a spare key. Chloe would cry, apologize to them, and then quietly resent me for enforcing the rules she was too terrified to uphold. The friction was a constant, low-level hum in our relationship. When this 2-week solo business trip to Europe came up, it felt like a massive psychological release. 14 days of absolute independence. Chloe promised she would use the time to visit her friends and catch up on her own work. We had a firm agreement. No guests, no parties, no parents allowed in the house while I was gone. I left feeling a rare sense of total security, trusting that my physical boundaries were finally respected. I had meticulously locked the doors, engaged the security system, and flown across the Atlantic, completely unaware that I was leaving my fortress entirely unguarded from the inside. The illusion of safety is always the most dangerous vulnerability in any structure. I genuinely believed that my firm rules and the sheer weight of my financial ownership would serve as an impenetrable barrier against Greg and Susan's relentless entitlement. I thought my wife, despite her ingrained weaknesses, understood the absolute sanctity of my personal space. I spent those 2 weeks in Europe finalizing lucrative contracts, my mind totally clear, operating under the naive assumption that my home was resting exactly as I had left it. I didn't know that my absence wasn't seen as a vacation, but rather as an operational window. While I was thousands of miles away, analyzing structural load distributions for my firm, the structural integrity of my own life was being methodically dismantled by the people I was legally bound to. Every boundary I had fought so intensely to establish was being systematically erased. I was completely blind to the fact that my wife had handed them the keys. I returned 2 days earlier than scheduled due to a canceled secondary meeting in Paris. I didn't text Chloe. I just wanted to sleep in my own bed. As my taxi pulled into my upscale suburban driveway, my brain instantly short-circuited. The visual evidence of the invasion was immediate and deeply jarring. My vintage, restored 1968 Mustang, a vehicle I kept meticulously protected under a climate-controlled cover inside my locked garage, was sitting outside on the damp driveway, exposed to the elements. The cover was gone, and there was a fresh, jagged scratch along the driver's side door. In its rightful place inside the open garage sat Greg's rusted, leaking Dodge van, slowly dripping dark oil onto my pristine epoxy floor. I paid the driver, my hands trembling with a sudden, sharp surge of adrenaline. As I walked up the pathway, the violations multiplied. The sleek, modern blinds I had custom-ordered for the front windows had been violently ripped down. In their place hung hideous, cheap floral curtains, clumsily pinned to the drywall, completely destroying the clean architectural lines of the facade. The familiar, comforting scent of cedar and expensive leather that usually permeated the porch had been replaced by the heavy, pungent odor of stale cigarette smoke and cheap frying oil. The spatial violation was absolute and undeniable. Someone had not only breached the perimeter, they had aggressively marked their territory, erasing my presence with deliberate, calculated disrespect. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped animal as I stared at the new brass deadbolt. The sheer audacity of the scene paralyzed me for a fraction of a second. I had built this sanctuary. I owned the title. Yet, standing on my own concrete steps, I felt like a stranger trespassing on an alien property. I raised my fist and hammered on the thick oak wood until my knuckles were bruised and raw. The sound echoed through the quiet suburban street, a desperate alarm signaling the collapse of my personal security. I waited, listening to the muffled shuffling from within, my mind racing through every possible, terrible explanation for the chaotic scene before me. The locks clicked open, and the door swung wide to reveal my ultimate nightmare. The door creaked open, and my mother-in-law, Susan, stood in the threshold wearing a stained pink bathrobe, holding a mug of my expensive imported coffee. She looked at me not with shock, but with an expression of mild, dismissive annoyance, as if a door-to-door salesman had interrupted her morning routine. "David," she sighed, taking a slow sip. "You're back early. You really should have called ahead. The house is an absolute mess." The surreal nature of the interaction hit me like a physical blow. She was standing inside my home, dictating the terms of my arrival. I pushed past her, my shoulder roughly grazing the doorframe, and stepped into the foyer. My brain struggled to process the visual data. The interior structure of my life had been aggressively dismantled. My mid-century modern entryway console was gone, replaced by a mountain of overflowing cardboard boxes and garbage bags smelling of mildew. "Where's my furniture, Susan?" I demanded, my voice dangerously low and vibrating with suppressed rage. "Where is Chloe?" Susan rolled her eyes, casually adjusting her robe. "Oh, stop being so dramatic, David. Your little tables were completely impractical. Greg moved them to a storage unit. Or maybe he sold them. We needed the space for our things. Chloe is at work, obviously." She said it was perfectly fine. The sheer sociopathic entitlement in her voice was breathtaking. She hadn't just moved in. She had unilaterally decided to erase my aesthetic, my property, and my authority. I walked toward the living room, my boots crunching over something sticky on the hardwood floor. The air was thick with the suffocating humidity of too many bodies in a closed space. What would you do if your carefully curated reality was casually thrown in the trash by someone who despised you? I felt an overwhelming urge to physically throw her out onto the lawn, to reclaim my space by sheer force. But I knew the law, and I knew an assault charge would instantly destroy my leverage. I had to maintain my analytical focus, even as every primitive instinct screamed for immediate, violent retribution. I left her standing in the ruined foyer and marched directly toward my private office, the final bastion of my sanity. I pushed open the office door and came face to face with pure theft. I pushed open the heavy oak door to my home office, the room where I handled all my confidential financial planning and architectural drafting. The space was completely unrecognizable. My massive, custom-built walnut desk, an expensive antique I had inherited from my grandfather, was entirely missing. In its place stood a cheap, sagging inflatable mattress covered in stained sheets. My locked filing cabinets had been pried open, their contents violently shoved into plastic bins. Standing in the center of the room, wearing my custom-tailored silk robe and smoking a cigar indoors, was my father-in-law, Greg. He didn't even flinch when I entered. He just exhaled a thick cloud of blue smoke directly toward the ceiling fan I had installed last summer. "Knock next time, David," Greg grunted, scratching his stomach. "This is our bedroom now." The absolute violation of the moment was paralyzing. "Get out," I said, my voice eerily calm despite the nuclear rage detonating in my chest. "Get your things, get your van out of my garage, and get out of my house right now." Greg laughed, a wet, hacking sound that sent a chill down my spine. He took a step forward, invading my personal space, trying to use his larger physical bulk to intimidate me. "Your house?" he sneered, jabbing a thick, calloused finger into my chest. "You're married to my daughter. What's yours is hers, and what's hers is family. We live here now. You don't make the rules anymore, little man." I looked around the room, taking a rapid, clinical inventory of my missing assets. My high-end monitors, my drafting tools, the antique desk, thousands of dollars of my personal, pre-marital property had simply vanished into thin air. "Where's my desk, Greg?" I asked softly, my mind already shifting from shock to cold, tactical calculation. He smiled, exposing yellowed teeth. "Sold it on Facebook Marketplace. Got a decent price, too. Paid for the moving truck." He had openly confessed to felony theft inside my own home. The audacity was so extreme it circled back to surrealism. He genuinely believed that his status as my father-in-law granted him absolute immunity from the law. I stepped back, removing myself from his physical striking distance, my architect's brain mapping out the destruction. I pulled out my phone and dialed my wife's number to demand the truth. Chloe answered on the third ring, her voice tight and defensive. "David, you're not supposed to be home until Friday." She wasn't relieved to hear from me. She was panicking because her operational timeline had been violently interrupted. I stood in the hallway of my ruined house, listening to Greg's television blaring in the background. "Chloe," I said, my tone completely devoid of emotion. "Your parents are living in my house. They changed the locks. They sold my grandfather's antique desk. Explain this to me right now." There was a long, excruciating pause on the line. Then, the gaslighting began, flowing from her mouth with practiced ease. "David, please don't overreact," she whispered urgently, stepping away from her desk at work. "It's just temporary. They had some financial trouble with their landlord, and they literally had nowhere else to go. I couldn't just leave them on the street. You have a massive house. You don't even use all the rooms." The betrayal felt like a physical knife twisting between my ribs. "I don't use all the rooms because it's my house, Chloe. My property. You allowed them to change the locks while I was out of the country. They just wanted to feel secure," she pleaded, her voice rising in fake distress. "Why are you being so selfish? They are family. We can buy you a new desk. Just be nice to them until we figure this out." The terrifying realization crashed over me. This wasn't a spontaneous emergency. This was a highly coordinated, premeditated ambush. She had waited for me to leave the country, knowing I couldn't intervene, and handed over the keys to my kingdom. She was the ultimate enabler, sacrificing my sanctuary, my property, and my mental health to appease her parasitic parents. She had chosen them over our marriage, over my safety, and over the law. "There is no way figuring this out," I told her coldly. "I am calling the police, and I am having them removed for trespassing and theft." "You can't," she shrieked, panic finally breaking through her facade. "I gave them permission, David. I gave them a lease." The word echoed in my ear, a fatal legal bullet fired directly at my structural foundation. My own wife had legally weaponized my property against me, trapping me in a bureaucratic nightmare. I hung up the phone and immediately dialed the local police emergency dispatch number. 10 minutes later, a patrol car pulled into my driveway, parking directly behind Greg's leaking van. Officer Ben, a pragmatic local cop in his 40s who actually lived a few streets over, stepped out. I met him on the porch, my adrenaline surging as I explained the situation. "Illegal entry. changed locks, stolen property. Ben nodded sympathetically, taking notes on his heavy clipboard. We walked inside together. Greg was waiting in the living room, looking incredibly smug, holding a crumpled piece of paper. "Officers, this man is harassing us," Greg lied smoothly, handing the paper to Ben. "We are legal tenants here." Ben reviewed the document. It was a standard, boilerplate residential lease agreement, downloaded from the internet. At the bottom, next to Greg and Susan's signatures, was Chloe's signature, officially acting as the landlord. Ben sighed heavily, lowering his clipboard. The look in his eyes told me everything I needed to know before he even spoke. "David," Ben said quietly, pulling me aside into the hallway. "I know this is your house. I know you bought it before you were married. But your wife lives here. She has established residency, and she signed a lease granting them tenancy. Because they have established residency and possess a signed lease from a resident, this is no longer a criminal trespass issue. It is a civil matter." I stared at him, the legal wall suddenly rising up and completely blocking out the sun. "They stole my furniture. They changed my locks without my consent," I argued, my voice trembling with suppressed fury. "You can file a civil suit for the property," Ben explained patiently, clearly frustrated by the law himself. "But I cannot physically drag them out of this house today. If I do, I'm violating their tenant rights, and the city gets sued. You have to go through the formal, legal eviction process through the courts. It could take months." I was officially trapped in my own home. The law, designed to protect vulnerable renters from abusive landlords, had been completely inverted to protect parasitic invaders from the rightful owner. Greg smirked at me from the sofa, turning up the volume on the television. He knew exactly what he had done. I was forced to sleep in my own house as a hostage to them. The next 4 days were an exercise in acute, agonizing psychological torture. Because the police refused to intervene, I was forced into a brutal war of attrition inside my own property. I retreated to the master bedroom, installing a heavy-duty, commercial-grade keyed deadbolt on the interior door. It was the only space left in the house that I truly controlled. Chloe refused to come home, texting me that she was staying at a friend's apartment, until I calmed down and accepted the new family dynamic. Her cowardice was absolutely staggering. Outside my bedroom door, Greg and Susan waged a relentless, passive-aggressive campaign to break my spirit. They ate my expensive imported groceries, leaving me empty, greasy containers piled up on the beautiful granite kitchen island. They intentionally broke my delicate espresso machine, claiming it was too complicated. Greg would blast the television at maximum volume at 2 in the morning, knowing I had to be up early for architectural client meetings. When I walked through the house to leave for work, Susan would make loud, mocking comments about my clothes, my career, and my inability to provide for my family properly. They treated my absolute helplessness as a hilarious joke. They genuinely believed they had won. They thought that because I was a civilized, rule-following professional, I would eventually just submit to their dominance and accept my new role as their permanent financial host. The smell of their stale smoke and unwashed clothes permeated the central air conditioning, a constant, violating reminder of my defeat. But they severely underestimated the exact nature of my personality. I am not a man who accepts structural failure. I am an architect. When a building's load-bearing walls are compromised, you don't just sit in the rubble and cry. You meticulously survey the damage, you identify the weak points, and you prepare for a controlled, devastating demolition. I stopped arguing with them entirely. I stopped asking them to turn down the volume. I stopped demanding my stolen property back. My silence wasn't submission. It was the quiet, dangerous focus of a predator calmly studying its trapped prey. I bought a hidden camera, a digital recorder, and began my secret, relentless audit. I shifted my mindset from victim to forensic investigator. My analytical brain completely overrode my emotional trauma. Every morning, after Greg and Susan went to sleep, they rarely woke up before noon. I would quietly leave my locked bedroom and conduct a meticulous, clinical audit of my own house. I photographed the deep scratches on the hardwood floors caused by them dragging heavy, rusted tools inside. I documented the shattered drywall in the guest bathroom where Greg had violently ripped a towel rack out of the studs. I compiled a massive spreadsheet detailing every single missing item, cross-referencing it with my original purchase receipts and insurance inventories. The financial scope of their theft was utterly staggering. It wasn't just my grandfather's antique desk. They had pawned my collection of vintage vinyl records, sold 2 of my expensive road bicycles out of the garage, and completely raided my locked wine cellar, drinking thousands of dollars of irreplaceable vintage Bordeaux like it was cheap water. They were liquidating my carefully built life to fund their daily existence. I also began wearing a highly sensitive, voice-activated digital recorder hidden in my breast pocket whenever I was forced to interact with them in the common areas. I recorded Susan casually admitting that they had thrown away my personal tax documents to make room in the filing cabinet for her coupon binders. I recorded Greg aggressively threatening to smash my teeth in if I ever tried to disconnect the premium cable package I was paying for. I was building a massive, legally airtight fortress of irrefutable evidence. The fake lease Chloe had signed protected them from immediate police removal, but it absolutely did not protect them from felony grand larceny, deliberate destruction of property, and criminal terroristic threats. I wasn't just documenting bad behavior. I was systematically gathering the exact ammunition required to legally destroy them. The more evidence I collected, the colder and more detached I became. I watched them sit on my sofa, drinking my wine and laughing at me, completely oblivious to the fact that they were starring in their own prosecution. I needed to understand exactly why they were so desperate to claim my home. While the physical audit of my house was critical, I needed to understand the underlying structural mechanics of their invasion. Why the sudden, desperate move? Chloe had claimed they had issues with their landlord, but my analytical mind knew that was a pathetic, surface-level lie. I hired a private investigator, a former forensic accountant I occasionally used for complex corporate real estate vetting, to dig deeply into Greg and Susan's financial history. The dossier he delivered to my secure office email 2 days later was an absolute masterpiece of hidden financial ruin. Greg and Susan hadn't just been evicted from a rental. They had lost their own massive, fully paid-off home to a brutal bank foreclosure. The root cause wasn't medical debt or a tragic job loss. It was Greg's severe, completely unchecked gambling addiction. Over the past 5 years, he had secretly taken out multiple, high-interest secondary mortgages on their property to fund his trips to off-track betting parlors and illegal underground poker games. When the credit ran out, he started borrowing from violent, unsavory lenders. Susan knew everything and had actively helped him forge documents to hide the bleeding from the banks. They were completely bankrupt, facing massive civil judgments, and had absolutely zero retirement savings left. They hadn't come to my house for a temporary stay. They had orchestrated a permanent, hostile takeover. Their plan was to legally entrench themselves in my pre-marital asset, use Chloe to slowly drain my high-income salary, and essentially treat me as their personal, captive ATM for the rest of their natural lives. They were financial parasites who had successfully killed their last host and had now firmly attached themselves to me. The sheer, calculated evil of the plan extinguished any remaining shred of empathy I had for my wife. She wasn't just an enabler. She was the active conduit for my destruction. Understanding their absolute desperation gave me the ultimate tactical advantage. They had no money, no alternative shelter, and no legal defense against the mountain of criminal evidence I was meticulously compiling against them. They were cornered rats. It was finally time to schedule a meeting with a truly ruthless property attorney. I didn't hire a standard family lawyer. I hired a shark who specialized in aggressive commercial property evictions and high-stakes financial divorces. Sitting in his stark, glass-walled office overlooking the city, I laid out my massive binder of evidence. The property deed in my name only, the fraudulent lease Chloe had signed, the spreadsheets of stolen property, the receipts, the photos of the damage, and the USB drive containing Greg's recorded physical threats. The lawyer, a cold, pragmatic man named Vance, reviewed the documents with silent, predatory approval. "Your wife made a critical, fatal legal error," Vance explained, tapping the fake lease with his expensive pen. "Because this house is a pre-marital asset, titled solely in your name. She possesses zero legal authority to act as a landlord or grant tenancy to anyone without your explicit, written consent. The lease is totally fraudulent. That nullifies their squatter protections." But Vance didn't want to just file a standard eviction. He wanted to execute a flawless, synchronized legal strike. We drafted an emergency, ex parte court order for immediate removal, bypassing the standard 30-day notice by leveraging the irrefutable evidence of felony grand larceny and the recorded threats of physical violence. Simultaneously, Vance drafted an ironclad divorce petition against Chloe, citing severe financial infidelity, fraud, and emotional abuse. "We don't just ask them to leave," Vance smiled grimly. "We drop a legal nuclear bomb on the property so fast they don't even have time to pack their stolen goods." The plan required precise timing. We needed the element of total surprise to prevent Greg from intentionally destroying the house in a fit of retaliatory rage once he realized he had lost. I was instructed to go home, act completely defeated, and wait for the judge to sign the emergency orders. The psychological relief of finally having an offensive strategy was intoxicating. I walked back into my house that evening, ignoring the smell of stale smoke and Susan's mocking laughter, feeling completely invincible beneath my quiet exterior. I just had to survive one more weekend without giving away my lethal intentions. Greg, sensing my unnatural calm, grew increasingly agitated. Parasites panic when their host stops struggling. He realized his passive-aggressive tactics were no longer generating the fear and compliance he desperately craved. On Sunday afternoon, he decided to force the issue, attempting to execute a classic, desperate legal maneuver. He wanted to provoke me into a physical altercation. If I threw a punch, he could immediately call the cops, file assault charges, get a domestic violence restraining order against me, and gain sole, exclusive possession of the house. I was standing in the kitchen, quietly pouring a glass of water, when he aggressively cornered me against the granite counter. He reeked of cheap whiskey and stale sweat. "You think you're better than us, don't you?" he slurred, deliberately knocking my glass into the sink where it shattered loudly. "You're a pathetic, weak little man. A real man would have thrown us out by now. But you can't, because you're a coward." He shoved his thick chest against mine, his face inches from my nose. My hand instinctively balled into a fist. Every fiber of my being wanted to shatter his jaw and reclaim my dignity. But my hidden digital recorder was silently running in my pocket, capturing every single breath, every slur, every threat. "Hit me," Greg taunted, shoving me harder against the counter. "Come on, architect. Throw a punch. Let's see what you've got." I looked directly into his bloodshot, desperate eyes, my expression utterly blank, a perfect mask of cold, calculating ice. "I am not going to hit you, Greg," I said softly, my voice perfectly steady and clearly enunciated for the recording. "Please step away from me. You are threatening me in my own home." He growled in frustration, spitting on the floor near my shoes, before storming out of the kitchen. He had failed to trigger my self-destruction. Instead, he had just handed me the final, irrefutable piece of audio evidence required to secure the emergency removal order from the judge. The trap was now fully armed and locked. Tuesday morning arrived, bringing a storm they could never have possibly prepared for. Tuesday morning dawned crisp and brilliantly clear. I woke up at 6 a.m., packed a small overnight bag, and quietly walked out the front door, locking it behind me. I didn't go to my architectural firm. I drove my car around the corner and waited. At exactly 8:30 a.m., the synchronized strike team arrived at my property. 2 marked police cruisers pulled into the driveway, blocking Greg's rusted van. Officer Ben stepped out of the lead car, accompanied by a seasoned court process server and a professional, heavily bonded moving crew I had hired at immense personal expense. I walked up my driveway and handed Ben the freshly signed emergency judge's order. It mandated the immediate removal of Greg and Susan based on fraudulent tenancy, active theft, and terroristic threats. Ben nodded, a look of profound, professional satisfaction on his face. He pounded his heavy maglite flashlight against the front door. "Police department, open up," he shouted. A minute later, a groggy, confused Greg opened the door in his underwear. The absolute shock that washed over his face was the most beautiful thing I have ever witnessed. Ben didn't give him a single second to argue. "Greg, you are being served with an emergency, immediate eviction order and a civil summons for felony theft," Ben stated loudly, his voice echoing down the quiet street. "You have exactly 15 minutes to gather your personal clothing and exit the premises, or you will be arrested and removed in handcuffs." Greg began to scream, his face turning an unhealthy shade of purple, but two large officers stepped directly into the foyer, forcing him backward. Susan appeared at the top of the stairs, shrieking hysterically, clutching her pink bathrobe. The professional moving crew immediately surged into the house, carrying heavy-duty trash bags. The chaotic, agonizing nightmare I had endured for weeks was abruptly inverted. My home was finally being purged. I stood on the sidewalk, my arms crossed, watching the structural integrity of their parasitic reality completely collapse. Then, a frantic car slammed to a halt at the curb right behind me. It was Chloe. She had received a panicked, screaming phone call from her mother and had rushed over from work. She sprinted across the damp lawn, her eyes wide with terror as she watched the professional movers literally tossing Greg and Susan's cheap belongings into black trash bags and dumping them unceremoniously onto the front yard. Greg was standing on the sidewalk in his sweatpants, screaming obscenities at Officer Ben, who was calmly resting his hand on his duty belt. Susan was sitting on the curb, weeping dramatically for the benefit of the neighbors who were now watching from their porches. "David, what are you doing?" Chloe shrieked, running up to me and grabbing my arm. "Stop this right now. You can't do this to my family." I looked at the woman I had married, feeling absolutely nothing but a cold, clinical detachment. I gently but firmly removed her hand from my jacket. I signaled to the court process server, who had been quietly waiting near my car. He stepped forward and handed Chloe a thick, heavy manila envelope. "Chloe," I said, my voice cutting through the chaotic noise of the street like a razor. "Those are your divorce papers. They include a comprehensive civil suit for the thousands of dollars of my personal property you allowed your parents to steal and pawn. You are no longer welcome in my house. You have 30 days to retrieve your personal items under police supervision, as outlined in the court order." She stared at the thick envelope in her trembling hands, her mouth opening and closing in silent, absolute shock. The enabler had finally been hit with the full, devastating consequences of her actions. There was no more gaslighting, no more fake leases, and no more compromises. The parasitic cord had been permanently, legally severed in front of the entire neighborhood. She collapsed onto the lawn next to her weeping mother. The three of them finally united in the complete financial and social ruin they had actively engineered. I turned my back on them and walked past the police line. I crossed the threshold of my front door and stepped into the beautiful silence. Standing inside my reclaimed house was a profoundly sobering experience. The silence was deafening, but the air was still thick with the lingering scent of their disrespect. The physical damage was extensive: scratched floors, ruined drywall, and the massive, echoing voids where my prized, antique furniture used to sit. The legal fees for the emergency eviction and the brutal, ongoing divorce drained a significant portion of my savings. Reclaiming my sanctuary required a massive, exhausting demolition of my own life. But as I walked through the empty rooms, I felt a deep, structural peace settling into my bones. The house was wounded, but the foundation was finally secure. It took me 6 full months to repair the physical damage, to replace the stolen items, and to financially recover from the Civil War. I never spoke to Chloe or her toxic parents again. My lawyer informed me that Greg's rusted van broke down completely, and they were forced to move into a cheap, cramped motel on the outskirts of the city, their fraudulent empire completely reduced to ashes. The most valuable lesson I learned wasn't about property law or complex legal strategy. It was about the dangerous, pervasive myth of family first. Toxic people will absolutely weaponize your empathy, your social conditioning, and your legal vulnerabilities to extract your resources. A boundary is not a suggestion. It is a critical, load-bearing wall that protects your mental and physical survival. If someone repeatedly ignores your boundaries, they are not family. They are an active threat. If you are ever faced with an invasion of your personal space or a violation of your fundamental rights, do not negotiate. Do not compromise. Step back. Completely remove your emotions from the equation. Gather your undeniable evidence in silence, and strike back with overwhelming, legally airtight force. Your peace, your sanity, and your sanctuary are always worth fighting for. Protect your foundation at all costs, because no one else will do it for you.